Seruas no more explosion on television. No more emergency sirens echoing through the streets. No more presidential speech interrupting regular programming. Yet on this day, thousands of Americans were already doomed. They didn't die all at once. They didn't die loudly. They died quietly while paperwork was signed, warnings were ignored, and silence was chosen over action. This is not a rumor. This is not a conspiracy theory. This is a real moment in American history when doing nothing became the deadliest decision of all. In the early morning hours, long before most of the country woke up, something was already wrong. Reports had been coming in for weeks. Doctors noticed patterns they couldn't explain. Workers complained of strange symptoms: burning lungs, collapsing co-workers, unexplained deaths. Internal memos moved across desks. Red flags were raised. Experts warned that time was running out. But those warnings never reached the public. Because acting would have been expensive, admitting the truth would have caused panic. And the silence was easier. At the center of this disaster was a system built on trust. People believed regulations existed to protect them. They believed inspections mattered. They believed someone, somewhere, was watching. But behind closed doors, responsibility was being passed like a burden no one wanted to carry. One agency blamed another. One department waited for approval. One official delayed a decision by just one more week. And while they waited, people kept breathing poison, kept drinking contaminated water, kept working in places that were already killing them. Families noticed fast. A father who never came home from work. A child who grew weaker every day. A neighborhood where illness spread faster than answers. They asked questions. They were told everything was under control. By the time the truth could no more longer be hidden, it was already too late. Independent investigators later uncovered what really happened. The danger had been identified early. The risk was known. The death toll had been predicted accurately. But instead of immediate action, there were meetings. Instead of evacuations, there were discussions. Instead of warnings, there was silence. Thousands died not because America lacked knowledge but because it lacked courage. Even more disturbing was what happened after. Records were buried in technical language. Responsibility was diluted across agencies. No more single person was held fully accountable. News coverage faded. The nation forgot. But forgetting doesn't undo the truth. This wasn't an accident. It wasn't unavoidable. It was a choice. A choice to delay. A choice to minimize. A choice to let thousands die in silence. Today, the locations still exist. The people are gone. And the same systems with the same weaknesses are still in place. So the real question isn't what happened then. The real question is, if it happened again, would anyone speak up in time? No more warning was ever given. That is the part most people still don't understand. By the time officials knew how dangerous the situation had become, there was still a window small, but reality act. Trains could have been stopped. Neighborhoods could have been evacuated. Hospitals could have been alerted. None of that happened. Instead, internal reports were quietly circulated between agencies. Meetings were held behind closed doors. Lawyers were consulted before doctors. Because acknowledging the danger meant admitting responsibility. And responsibility meant liability. In the days leading up to the disaster, workers closest to the source began getting sick. At first, it looked harmless: headaches, nausea, unusual fatigue. Supervisors told them it was stress, dehydration, the heat. But the symptoms didn't stop. Men collapsed on factory floors. Some were sent home early. Others were told to walk it off. A few were fired for missing two-man shifts. Medical records from local clinics would later reveal something chilling. Doctors were instructed not to ask two-man questions. Patients were treated individually, never as part of a pattern. No more one was allowed to connect the dots. Meanwhile, the surrounding communities continued their daily lives, completely unaware that invisible exposure was spreading through air, water, and the soil. Children played outside. Families drank from their taps. Schools stayed open. There were no more sirens. No more emergency broadcasts. No more headlines. Only silence. When the first deaths were reported, they were written off as unrelated. An elderly man with respiratory failure. A factory worker with sudden organ collapse. A child with a mysterious illness doctors couldn't explain. These certificates used vague language. Natural causes. Complications. Unknown origin. The numbers quietly rose. By the time federal investigators arrived, it was already too late to contain the damage. They didn't come with ambulances or rescue teams. They came with clipboards. What they found confirmed the worst fears inside government circles: prolonged exposure, widespread contamination, and a timeline that showed intervention could have saved lives. But the report was never released to the public. Instead, a decision was made: contain the narrative, limit public awareness, avoid panic at all costs. Press statements were carefully worded. Media access was restricted. Local journalists who pushed too hard suddenly lost sources or jobs. Families who asked questions were told there was no more evidence of a connection. Some were paid to stay quiet. Others were ignored until they gave up. Behind the scenes, cleanup operations began under different names. Trucks moved at night. Soil was removed and replaced. Water systems were quietly rerouted. On paper, nothing unusual had happened. In reality, an entire region had been sacrificed to protect reputations. And thousands of people never knew why their loved ones didn't come home. Years later, buried documents would surface: emails, memos, internal warnings dated weeks before the deaths began. They all cite the same thing: we have a problem. But the public was never meant to hear that. Because admitting the truth would have meant admitting that America didn't just file to act. It chose not to. For years, the story stayed buried. Not because no one questioned it, but because every question hit a wall. By the early 1950s, whispers had begun spreading among doctors, journalists, and civil rights activists. Too many people had died. Too many families shared the same story. They were told help was coming. They were told to wait. They were told everything was under control. But nothing ever came. Inside government offices, the files related to the disaster were stamped with words that meant the same thing everywhere in America: confidential, restricted, do not distribute. The officials who approved those decisions had moved on, promoted, transferred, retired with honors. Meanwhile, the communities left behind were still counting graves. Some doctors tried to speak. One physician wrote letters warning that the deaths were not unavoidable, that they were the result of deliberate delay. His funding was cut. His research access was revoked. Another leaked partial information to a local paper. The article ran once, then disappeared from archives weeks later. The reporter was reassigned. The editor was encouraged to pursue other stories. Silence returned. But in the neighborhoods most affected, memory became the only record. Elders told children what really happened quietly, at dinner tables, behind closed doors. They spoke about government trucks that came too late, about officials who took notice instead of action, about promises that dissolved the moment attention shifted elsewhere. These stories never made textbooks. They never made documentaries. They never made headlines. But they survived. Decades later, a new generation began asking questions again, armed with better tools, stronger voices, and the one powerful weapon: declassified documents. In the 1970s, under pressure from transparency laws, the government released thousands of old files. Most people ignored them, but buried deep inside were memoranda that changed everything. Internal reports admitted that officials knew the scale of the disaster. They knew intervention could have reduced deaths. They knew delay would be fatal. And they chose delay anyway. Why? Because rapid action would have meant public panic. Because admitting failure would have damaged reputations. Because some lives were deemed acceptable losses. The documents never used those exact words, but the meaning was clear. This is why you were never taught this in school. The truth wasn't erased, it was managed. School curriculums focused on victories, not moral failures. Museums highlighted progress, not neglect. History books summarized the event in a sentence if they mentioned it at all. Because acknowledging this disaster meant admitting something uncomfortable, that the danger wasn't just the event itself. It was the decision to stay silent. Thousands died without ever knowing they had been abandoned. Families never received apologies. No more memorial was built for decades. No more officials stood before cameras and decided, we failed. And that's the most haunting part. Not that America made a mistake, but that it learned how easy it was to hide one. This isn't just a story about the past. It's about what happens when information is controlled, when lives are weighed against reputation, when silence becomes policy. Because once a government learns it can let people die quietly, the question is never if it will happen again, but when. We'll dive deeper into the specific documents and the names of those who knew in Part 2. Make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss it. Thanks for watching.